We talk about the lymphatic system and the immune system together because they work with each other in a lot of ways in order to help you fight off different pathogens that get into your body. So let's take a look at the lymphatic system first and take a look at the structures, and then we'll take a look at the immune system and how it uses the lymphatic system to kind of mount an attack. So first of all, the lymphatic system, one of the main functions is to drain away excess fluid that builds up in the capillary beds. So if you remember back when we talked about blood vessels and we talked about capillaries and how on the arterial side of a capillary bed, more fluid is lost to the tissues than is reabsorbed by the capillaries. So you end up with a net movement of fluid leaving the blood and going into the area surrounding the tissues. And if this isn't drained by the lymphatic system, it can lead to edema or swelling. So you can see in this picture here, this is a very, very serious case of the lymphatic system not working properly. So you can see that the lymphatic system in the leg is not draining that fluid away, and all that fluid is building up and causing some really, really major problems here. The lymphatic structures also house immune cells. So it's one way that immune cells can basically become exposed to pathogens like bacteria and viruses because all that fluid moves through the lymphatic system and it actually gets filtered in these structures called lymph nodes. And at the lymph nodes, all of the bacteria and viruses and pathogens that are in that fluid are exposed to the immune cells, which can start to mount a defense and kill off the cells and the viruses that could make you sick. They also, with the lymphatic system, also has a role in transporting dietary fats and fat-soluble vitamins. And we'll talk more about this function when we get to the digestive system a little bit later in the semester. Now, if you recall, the blood circulatory system is a closed loop with the blood going from the heart through arteries to capillary beds and then back through veins to the heart. And that blood keeps moving in one direction through this circuit. Well, the lymphatic system is made up of lymphatic vessels that only move fluid in one direction. Because remember, we said that on the arterial side of the capillary bed, more fluid is pushed out of the capillaries into the spaces surrounding the tissues. Some of that fluid gets reabsorbed by the venules and returned to the bloodstream, but a lot of it gets stuck in this area. And so the lymphatic vessels, they first start out as these kind of blind-ended capillaries, and that fluid moves into the capillaries, and then the lymphatic vessels converge and drain in together, and they ultimately drain into these things called lymph nodes, which we'll talk about in a second. And then ultimately that lymph, which is what we now call the fluid that's inside the lymphatic structures, gets returned to the bloodstream. So it does ultimately go back into the blood. It just goes through the lymphatic structures first before it gets returned to the bloodstream. Now, if we look at these lymphatic capillaries that are also intertwined with the blood vessel capillaries and these capillary beds here, we can see that they are a blind end because remember, the lymph is being transported in one direction. And the fluid, if you look at the cells here in the capillaries, you'll see how the cells kind of overlap a little bit, creating valves. Well, what happens is when fluid builds up outside the lymphatic capillary, it actually pushes in, and that fluid enters the lymphatic capillary. And so there's really no pump that moves the lymph around. It's just the pressure buildup of the fluid being filtered into the tissue spaces that then pushes the fluid into the lymphatic capillaries. From the lymphatic capillaries, as we mentioned, the vessels converge and drain into larger and larger vessels, and they ultimately converge into lymphatic trunks, where the fluid is then returned to the bloodstream. Now, the lymphatic vessels don't have a pump, so the circulatory system, the blood, has a heart, and the heart is responsible for creating the pressure that moves the blood throughout the blood vessels. The lymphatic system structures, the vessels of the lymphatic system, don't have a pump like that. But they do have some other things that help to kind of squeeze the lymph through the vessels. It's almost like milking them through it. So think about almost like a tube of toothpaste where you're squeezing it from one side to the other. So first of all, there are valves that are found inside the lymphatic vessels, very similar to the valves that are found in some of the bigger veins. And these valves help to ensure that once the lymph is pushed up past the valve, it's not going to fall back down due to gravity. Additionally, similar to veins, lymphatic vessels can also be kind of squeezed by skeletal muscles to help squeeze that lymph through the lymphatic structures. And also breathing, so thoracic pressure. This is the pressure in your thoracic cavity. So taking deep breaths can also help to squeeze that lymph through the lymphatic vessels. Now, there are other organs associated with the lymphatic system, and we're going to take a look at primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs. So primary lymphoid organs are where lymphocytes develop and mature. Lymphocytes are a type of leukocyte, and if you remember, a leukocyte is also known as a white blood cell. And so these lymphocytes are a specific type of white blood cell that's associated with a particular part of the immune response, and we'll talk about the role a little bit later. Lymphocytes can be further broken down into B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, and the B lymphocytes are also just called B cells, and T lymphocytes are just called T cells. The red bone marrow is the primary lymphoid organ where the B cells develop and mature. T cells also develop in the red bone marrow, but then they're transported to the thymus where they mature in the thymus. And that's one way that these cells got their names, because B cells develop and mature in the bone marrow, and T cells, even though they develop in the bone marrow, they mature in the thymus, which starts with a T. And you can see on the picture here that the thymus is a gland located in kind of the chest area here, and it's most active during the younger years. So younger kids tend to get sicker more, but that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because you're exposing their body to different pathogens that they're then building up immunity against. Now, secondary lymphoid organs are organs where these B cells and T cells actually come into contact with pathogens like bacteria and viruses and mount the immune responses. So the lymph nodes, which we kind of talked about a little bit, they filter the fluid as the fluid moves through the lymphatic vessels. The spleen houses lymphocytes, and the blood that goes there comes in contact with those B cells and T cells. And there are also these structures called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, which is also just called MALT. And the most common one that you're probably familiar with are the tonsils. And then there are others called Peyer's patches, and then the appendix is also considered a MALT structure. So first of all, we'll take a look at the lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes house some different immune cells, and we'll talk a little bit more about what these immune cells do when we get to the immune system part of this lesson. But some of the immune cells they house are macrophages, dendritic cells, and then our lymphocytes, the B cells and T cells. So as that fluid is being drained from the capillary bed and being transported through the lymphatic vessels, that fluid gets filtered in these lymph nodes, and that fluid, it comes in contact with these immune cells. And so if there's bacteria in that fluid or viruses or some sort of parasite, the immune cells there can start mounting an initial defense against them. The spleen contains macrophages and dendritic cells, and they help to remove microbes, which are basically microscopic things that can make you sick. They also help to break down red blood cells and either excrete or recycle the components to be reused. Now the maw, as we mentioned, we've got the tonsils, Peyer's patches, and appendix, and these are just areas of mucous membranes in these different structures that they really serve a purpose of trapping pathogens and exposing them to immune cells in the body. So it might sound counterintuitive that they actually pull these pathogens, these things that can make you sick, deeper into your body, but they do that to expose them to the immune cells so that your immune system can then respond to them and fight them off. So the tonsils are located in the pharynx, which is also known as the throat region. Peyer's patches are located in the walls of the small intestine. And then the appendix, it juts off of a structure called the cecum, and the cecum is the first part of the large intestine.